feeling about being in the middle of the room, and she moved her chair back against the wall. And she had the young children beside her, the two young girls on either side of her and the little boy beside her, and they were all together against the wall when the mud started coming in and increasing, and it was a terrible situation. Eventually the mud came so high that they were in danger.
The two children, little Mona on my lap and Adolphus beside me, talked on for some time. I suppose the mud began to press them. A button on my dress was forced deeply into Mona's cheek. Mona said, "Give me more room, Dolphy, you are pressing me up." He replied, "I can't help it." Mona cried to me to give her more room, as I was pressing her against the beam, but the load of volcanic mud pouring down on me prevented me from being able to render any assistance, and the child was crushed and smothered in my arms and died. My little boy, who had been standing by me, said, "We can't live, can we?" And I replied, "No, dear, we will die together." He then said, "Jesus will come and take us," and I never heard his voice again. Edna, I think, died shortly after Adolphus, as she said, "Oh, my head," as the mud was beating down on her, and she spoke no more. Amelia Hazard.
On the 10th of June 1886, dawn did not break at Te Wairoa. The air was full of ash, smoke and debris. But at about 8 in the morning, the light gradually intensified to a nightmarish gloom.
There was total devastation. Places they had known had disappeared. There was mud up to the rafters of some of the smaller houses. There was the worry of what had happened to their children, to their wives, to their families. They didn't know where they were. Most fortunately had been lucky enough to get to Sophia's whare or to Hine Mihi, or in some cases remained in their own houses, which were fairly substantial and withstood the weight of mud that had been dumped on them.
The devastation got to them. They couldn't believe that where it was so verdant and lovely, well, pasture land, they were cultivating crops. And then in the space of, what, barely 24 hours, there was just nothing.
In the freezing cold and the hellish half-light, most of the survivors set out for Rotorua, 17 kilometres away over a dramatically changed landscape.
Mother used to speak about their journey into Rotorua through the Tiki Tapu bush, and of course it was desolation and trees stripped of their leaves, and in walking, they were walking for a while, and she said she was very tired, she wanted to sit down. And they said, "But you can't, don't you see the danger around you?" She said by that time she had no feeling, no sense of danger, so evidently it was shock.
And for the people of Rotorua, there was terror that everybody out here had probably been lost at Te Wairoa. And immediately those in Rotorua came out as far as they could to find out what had happened to all those people living around Tarawera.
As we reached the Blue Lake, we were met by our friends from Rotorua who came to look for us, thinking we were killed. They were delighted to see us safe, but many began to cry when they heard of those they had lost, relations and friends. So whaia Hinerangi.
A number of the men now turned back to Te Wairoa to look for survivors under the metres of ash and mud. With tools salvaged from the wreck of the Rotumahana Hotel, the men began to dig through the rubble of the Hazard House. About an hour later, one of the rescuers thought he heard a sound from the debris. They dug frantically, and in a few minutes uncovered a part of Amelia Hazard's dress.
Quite a thrill was caused by seeing her fingers moving, showing that she was alive. We called to her that we would soon have her out. Charles Humphreys.
Incredibly, Amelia had survived. But her young children and her husband had not. Their bodies were later dug from the rubble. Over the next 2 days, more survivors were found amidst the ruins of Tarawera. But the Tūhourangi would not search for Tūhoto and were anxious to leave him buried, lest unearthing him provoke fresh disasters.
They had no timeline, saying that he caused everything. And I don't believe that.
Eventually, several of the Europeans decided they would look for Tūhoto.
Finally, I forced my way in at the front of the whare and was almost stifled by the foul air whilst getting the old fellow out. He was known to be at least 120 years of age and had been thus buried over 3 days. He sat like a smoke-dried skeleton on my muddy knee and presently was able to swallow some tinned milk and biscuit procured from the ruins of the hotel. Presently, the bleared and cunning eyes began to brighten in the wicked old face that was a marvel of tattooing. Then he leered around in an unearthly kind of way and said, "You are all spirits." Arthur Vaughan.
In the days immediately following the eruption, no one had been able to cross the lake to determine the fate of the many Maori living beneath the mountain. After dragging a pair of boats on a cart 17 kilometres across the mud and ash from Rotorua, a search party set off to find out. The boat's first destination was Mauda, a small village at the edge of the lake. A stand of karaka trees, which had formerly stood by Mauda, was found floating in the water. Where Mauda had been was a slide of near-liquid mud, which the rescue party sank into when they tried to land. Mauda had been completely obliterated, the fate of its 20 or so Ngāti Rangitihi inhabitants too awful to contemplate.
From Lake Rotumahana over in that direction, about another 2 to 3 kilometres away, when the explosion occurred there, the material that was thrown out formed a base surge which came rolling across the country, invisible to them here, until suddenly it would have appeared like a huge tidal wave over the top of that ridge, and a few seconds later enveloped them, and they would have had absolutely no chance of escape.
Ake hōtau, e hinga tū, te pō, moi mai to te tāriki, a te rungarawa, moi mai.
The next village, Taariki, had also been smashed by stones before being smothered with ash and mud. Taariki had apparently suffered as dreadful a fate as Mauda.
They knew where the apartheid was, but it was about 30 feet of dirt on top. And they just left them there. That's all those people there lying there. Years later, as the place broke up, they were coming across bodies of the victims of the eruption. My people.
Abandoned by his people, Tūhoto Ariki was taken to the Rotorua Sanatorium and placed under the care of a European doctor.
In the hospital, he was washed and his hair was cut. Now, to do that to any Maori, to interfere with the head, was a terrible thing, a breach of the tapu that I've spoken of before. But in the case of a tohunga, it was, according to many, fatal for the tohunga. And he was only in there for a few days before he died.
Word of his demise was sent to the Arawa tribe, but its members would have none of him. He caused the eruption, the leading tribesman declared. It was he who brought upon us the wrath of heaven. You are responsible for unearthing him. His life presence was a menace to us, and his body would be 1,000-fold more so. Do with his remains as you wish, and take the penalty, but do not seek to cloud upon us the curse of the spirits which have ever enveloped him.